Chevy Chase at Home engages our community in social and educational programming, both in person and virtually, such as now. We also provide volunteer services to older adults who need assistance, including rides, errands, tech support, household assistance, and friendly visits. And what's going on today is our wonderful program with journalist Marvin Kalb, who has published, is it his 17th book or 18th? 17th book. And Marvin is the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice Emeritus at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he was also the founder of the Shorenstein Center on the Media, Politics, and Public Policy. A recipient of numerous journalism awards, he had a long and distinguished career as an international correspondent, documentarian, and moderator at CBS and NBC, and served as chief diplomatic correspondent and host of the popular Kalb Report. He's the author of 17 books on Russia, the media, and foreign policy. And as one of the few Russian-speaking foreign correspondents in the Soviet Union during the 1960s, he had unusual access to President Khrushchev and other Soviet officials. His latest publication, A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course, covers the intense period of nuclear proliferation, erection of the Berlin Wall, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think when you say a different Russia, Marvin, you're referring to a different Russia from Putin's Russia, from the Russia we're dealing with now, right?
Yes.
Very different attitude towards the West and relations between us, I think.
Exactly.
And you were there to behold it all. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan, Jen, everybody. I've been doing a number of these talks in the Washington neighborhood, and it's a pleasure to get back to Chevy Chase, and I thank you.
Which you are part of.
I'd like to start with an analysis of the name of the book, really, A Different Russia.
Okay.
And Susan, you touched on that, and the word different requires a definition in this case, and I will be providing it. The subtitle, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, Kennedy, the leader of the United States. We are, if you put your minds back, in the early stages of the Cold War. At that particular time, these two huge countries loaded with nuclear weapons were in antagonistic positions one to the other. There was constant suspicion. There was the deepest kind of feeling of distrust. It was not, as you all, I'm sure, remember, a happy time in international relations. It was, however, for me as a journalist, a happy time because when there's trouble, journalism loves it. And it was for me my first foreign correspondent job at CBS or anywhere for that matter. And I was very excited about it. It was, in fact, a thrilling operation for me, and I enjoyed it immensely. Let me try to analyze that subtitle. You have these two nations on a collision course. It started on January 20th, 1961, when John Kennedy took the oath of office to become the next president of the United States. What was extremely interesting in Moscow at this time was that almost on the same day, the Russians put out a long speech by Nikita Khrushchev, not that he had just delivered, no, that he had delivered months before, but they wanted it put out as a kind of counterpoint to Kennedy coming into office. The point of the speech was to demonstrate to the entire world what Khrushchev's vision of the world was. He was a boisterous, very busy, um, large figure in a small box. He was about 5'5" in height and width. He was very energetic. He was the kind of guy who never sat in the same chair more than 10 minutes. He was on the move at all times. He wanted things to happen. And he wanted it to be a different kind of Russia. He wanted it to be a Russia distinctly different from Stalin's Russia, which had ended 3 years earlier in 1953 with his death. Khrushchev comes along and in 1956 makes another kind of speech in which he denounces Stalin. And he says to the Russian people and the world, we are moving in a different direction now. It's still communism. We want the entire world to be communist, but it's going to be very different from Stalin. We're going to open our society up. Along comes Kennedy, and in Khrushchev's mind, in the most peculiar way, he had the idea that if he could sit down with Kennedy, or with any American president for that matter, just the two of them, they would, over a matter of a day or two, settle all the problems of the world. The division of Berlin, no problem. Vietnam, no problem. Nuclear weapons, we'll take care of it, no problem. This was a totally naive, unrealistic vision on Khrushchev's part, but it was essential to understanding how the man was thinking at that time. I had an opportunity more frequently, perhaps, than other American reporters of getting close to him, not just because I was the tallest American reporter at the time, but because he knew me from 1956 and for a combination of reasons called me Peter the Great. And as Peter the Great, I was able to get a microphone close to him to pick up things that he was saying that other reporters were not able to do. It was an advantage to be Peter the Great. One of the things that came up almost immediately in February, the following month, was that a man named Patrice Lumumba, some of you may remember from the Congo, he was murdered. And Khrushchev had seen Lumumba as his Castro, the guy he was going to use in Africa to do what he was trying to do in Latin America with Castro. Kennedy spotted this, working with the Belgians, worked it out so that Lumumba was killed. Khrushchev was furious because it undercut his entire Africa policy. Furious or not, he still had in mind a deal with Kennedy. 2 months later, the Bay of Pigs. This completely threw Khrushchev, as it did Kennedy, for entirely different reasons. Kennedy was thrown because it was a mark on his administration that he never quite lived down. It was an indication that he was not in charge in the way that an American president ought to be. And Khrushchev thought, following his setback in Africa, 2 months later, he might be able to gain a specific advantage over Kennedy by way of the Bay of Pigs. And he sought to achieve that advantage. And he did it in different ways. He did it with speeches. He did it with trips around the world. He did it by projecting to the world the image of what he called a new Russia. Well, what he wanted deep down, as I said, was this meeting, a summit, a deal with Kennedy. And they worked it out for Vienna the first weekend in June 1961. That summit was greeted with enormous expectation. Everyone assumed that great things were going to happen when these two men got together. In fact, by the second day, we, as the number of reporters, began to pick up signs, signals. I got something from a Russian official very close to Khrushchev, often served as his interpreter. And what I learned from him was that after the first day, Khrushchev was already deeply disappointed in what he was going to get with Kennedy. He imagined that his great expectation, sitting down and talking to Kennedy, would produce diplomatic miracles. That was not to be. By Sunday evening, it was quite clear when the meeting broke up that Khrushchev was furious. This was typical of the man. Kennedy had been tipped off in advance by his American ambassadors to the Soviet Union, experts like Charles Bolin, like Tommy Thompson, that Khrushchev was going to scream. He was going to say all kinds of outrageous things. That was the way he negotiated, to try very much to overwhelm the other side. Kennedy paid no attention to his experts. He thought he could do it all essentially on his own instincts he felt would be sufficient. And Khrushchev predictably exploded at the end, began to scream about Kennedy's fear of miscalculation. And he screamed the word miscalculation 3 or 4 times. He said, "I'm sick and tired of that word. Bury it. If you continue to talk about miscalculation, Mr. President, we may find ourselves in a war." That was certainly not what Kennedy expected, not what he wanted by any means. And Kennedy played it cool. And what he said was, "It's going to be a cold winter." Kennedy went back home and did 3 things almost immediately. He was so shocked by that explosion about miscalculation that the first thing he did, that's right, in July of 1961, after the summit, Kennedy did 3 things. The first, he sent additional American troops to Germany as a sign to Khrushchev, don't mess with us. Second, he increased the defense budget of the United States considerably. Third, he sent a private message to Khrushchev saying, it is in the interest of both countries that we cool it. Let us just cool it if we can. In Khrushchev's mind, what he was witnessing, and again, this was something I picked up from Russian officials who dealt with Khrushchev on a daily basis. Khrushchev took it into his mind that Kennedy was obviously young, but he was also weak, and he was also inexperienced. And Khrushchev believed on that analysis basis that he could take Kennedy to the cleaners and that he could advance communist interests all over the world by working with Kennedy, in a way taking advantage of Kennedy to extend communism. He thought he really could take him to the cleaners. And the first thing he did, which was a huge risk, Khrushchev paid a secret visit in early August to Berlin, divided Berlin, and with the Russian general, took a drive through the eastern part of the city along the very edge of the western part of the city. And they decided that if they built a wall through the city, it would stop the flow, the massive flow of East Europeans coming from east to west, particularly East Germans, leaving East Germany by way of the divided capital of Berlin into West Berlin, and then go on into West Germany. It was so large a flow of people that the economic structure of East Germany was on the very edge of collapse. That was pointed out to Khrushchev by the leader of East Germany, and he put it to Khrushchev in a very dramatic way that we must be saved. Khrushchev then made the decision about building the wall. That wall, as you all know, stayed in power, stayed in place until 1989, when it began to be broken down, not because the communists wanted it, but the Western world, in effect, opened the doors to the West, and the East continued its flow into the West. Very interesting thing happened at this point. A wonderful CBS reporter, Dan Shore, who was at that time based in Berlin, made a trip into East Germany. And what he picked up there was the beginning of a strong East German belief that if the United States had chosen at that point to knock down the wall, Khrushchev would have done nothing. Dan sent that word to me. I then began to do the best I could in finding people around Khrushchev to talk to him to get a feel whether this might be possible. I then made small trips of my own to different parts of the Soviet Union to try to find out whether there was any reason to believe that that was the case. What I found, much to my surprise, I must say, was that one Soviet official after another confirmed what it is that Dan had picked up in East Germany. And I was able to confirm Dan's story from the Soviet side. And we both reported that together on a special CBS reports. It was for Kennedy and for the Democratic Party a very considerable embarrassment. The wall was built in clear violation of World War II agreements, and aside from a number of hot rhetoric notes that the West sent to Khrushchev, the West did nothing. And that wall stayed in place, as I said, until 1989. Khrushchev further decided if he could get away with the wall, he probably could get away with a lot more. In the spring of 1962, again, this was a sort of surprise decision on his part, but it was consistent with his mindset as it developed throughout 1961. He was at a meeting in Bulgaria. One day, he and his defense minister walked along a beachfront area, the northwestern part of the Black Sea, looked at the Black Sea and looked across in the direction of Turkey. And Malinowski, his defense minister, said, "Sir, I got bad news for you. And the news is that the Americans have installed Jupiter missiles. Not that the missile is that great a big deal, but nevertheless, they can carry nuclear warheads. They would be very close to the Soviet Union. They are at this point directed at the Soviet Union." Khrushchev listened to this report and again exploded characteristically in anger. And then, according to a very good report, said to Malinowski, if they can do that to us in Turkey, we can do it to them in Cuba. We're going to put a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, and he's not going to like it. That then launched a most extraordinary secret movement of Soviet military power from different parts of the Soviet Union down to ports on the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles, across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic to Cuba, starting in May of 1962 and ending only on October 22nd of 62, when Kennedy delivered his famous televised statement to the entire world that the United States was instituting a quarantine around Cuba. We will stop all ships of any kind from entering Cuban waters. This was an act of war. If the Russians had challenged us, they would have a legal right to challenge us. Khrushchev chose not to do that. And for that period, throughout the summer, 50,000 Soviet troops were moved into Cuba. Countless numbers of missiles, medium and long range rather, were moved into Cuba and set up. A number of them, we later learned, with nuclear warheads set up in Cuba, pointing at the United States. What was again amazing about Kennedy's misreading of the intelligence was this. Starting at the end of August and throughout September of 62, Kennedy had, excuse me, Kennedy had intelligence from Cuban exiles that Russian troops and missiles were being installed in Cuba. Kennedy chose to read that not as the imposition of an offensive Soviet military force into Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. He saw it as a defensive operation, and he chose to do nothing. He did have planes flying over Cuba all the time. They were taking pictures. The pictures confirmed the buildup. Kennedy chose until the middle of October to regard that buildup as defensive. On the weekend before the Kennedy speech of October 22nd, Mac Bundy, who was his national security advisor, said on television, when asked about the buildup, he said they were defensive in nature. It's an amazing statement. And to those of us who were in Moscow at the time, I don't want to say we knew better, but there was obvious fact that stared at you, and you had to draw certain conclusions from that. Kennedy chose not to, for whatever reason. I assume political. There was an election coming up. The Democrats were in trouble. He didn't want to appear weak. And so until October 22nd, he did nothing, then changed his mind and radically shifted to another approach. And that was this quarantine. There then followed, that was on a Monday night. There then followed a week of building tension all over the world, aimed at this collision course that the two sides were on. At that moment, we were literally one decision away from the start of a nuclear war. In Moscow at the time, the Russian people clearly were told through the press, radio, television, exactly what it is that Khrushchev wanted them to know. And I thought it was stunningly clear on Tuesday night, and I want to tell you about this, on Tuesday night that Khrushchev was desperately trying to create an atmosphere that would lead to negotiating an end to this crisis. What happened on Tuesday night was that an American opera star, Jerome Hines, was at the Bolshoi Theater, and he was set to sing Boris Godunov, and he would do it in Russian. And he had been traveling around the entire country, and he was very successful. But this was the day after Kennedy laid down the law. What would Khrushchev do? Turns out that we had tickets to the opera that night. I told my dear wife that under no circumstances am I leaving the CBS office to go to an opera. There was a huge story, and that was my responsibility. She said, we're going, and I've learned over the years not to struggle too valiantly, and I yielded, and we went to the opera, and bingo. On the right, in the box, is Khrushchev, 4 members of his Politburo, Mrs. Khrushchev, a bright symbol of his desire to respect the United States and to talk to the United States. When the opera was over, Khrushchev led four standing ovations. Then he went backstage. My wife and I, we followed him and Mrs. Khrushchev backstage, and they was obviously going to see the opera star and his wife. The security people let me through. Once again, the good part about being Peter the Great. And there were then 6 people in this room, and I obviously couldn't resist. And I turned to Khrushchev and I said something like, I don't remember the exact words now, but are there people of goodwill who are prepared now to end this crisis? He looked at me and he said, hear me clearly. There are people of goodwill prepared to end this crisis. I ask, do those people include Kennedy and Khrushchev? He said, yes. Well, obviously it was a hell of a story, but putting that aside, it was a public indication that Khrushchev wanted desperately somehow to get out of the mess that he himself had created. On Wednesday, there was an opportunity to raise this idea of a summit meeting, another summit with Kennedy, and we'll take care of the problem. Kennedy's answer was, this is not a time for another summit. Get your missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev did not yield on that point. On Thursday of that week, the UN Secretary General says, let us have a pause for 3 weeks, during which time we'll have negotiations leading to a resolution of this crisis. Khrushchev instantly, quite literally, instantly, there were bulletins on Moscow radio, television, TASS, the news agency. They all put out the word, yes, let's accept this. Kennedy, again, not until you get your missiles out of Cuba. On Friday, everything turned quite, I can only say large question marks were all over the place. The embassies didn't know very much. The journalists did the best that we could. I made it a point every morning to go to the Moscow marketplace just on one of the outskirts of the city to try to find out what ordinary Russians were thinking, putting aside what Pravda was saying. And what ordinary Russians were saying was that we are not going to fight about Cuba. We will fight about Berlin, about Germany, but not Cuba, too far away. I broadcast this. It was, again, a good story. But in the communication between Khrushchev and Kennedy, on Friday night, the letter that Khrushchev sent to Kennedy again pleaded with a diplomatic exit to this current increasingly military crisis. Kennedy's answer, same. Out of your, get the missiles out. On Saturday, Khrushchev's letter to Kennedy was a very pessimistic one. The language seemed to have been written by the entire Politburo, not just by Khrushchev, which suggested to me that Khrushchev might at that point have been losing some of his authority within the Politburo because he was not writing the letters. The collective was writing the letters. On Sunday morning, the 28th of October, I again made my visit to the marketplace. It was the same line about no fighting over Cuba, but don't mess with us on Berlin. And we were all trying to find out, unsuccessfully, what it is that day that Khrushchev was telling Kennedy. Was it possible that he was backing away? Was there a way out of this mess? And what we learned also was that Kennedy had been put in a position, and perhaps it was his idea, that on Monday morning, were there no movement on the Soviet side that Sunday, on Monday morning, Kennedy would have ordered the invasion of Cuba. That would have led instantly to confrontation with Soviet forces. That would have led then to the next step, which would have been the use of nuclear weapons. At 3:00 in the afternoon on that fateful Sunday, I was at the Central Telegraph, and someone I knew from Moscow radio, a producer, no big deal at all, came in, and he was very nervous. And he began telling the people behind the desk who organized contacts with the outside world. He organized them. He was telling them, I could overhear him say, 5:00, that was very clear to me. And then I thought I heard him use the name Levitan. And that really set me off. Levitan was the #1 voice on Moscow radio ever since World War II. If Levitan came on the air, that was to announce something very important. And in the context of the Cuban crisis, it was either going to be war or peace. In my judgment, it had to be one or the other because of Levitan. I didn't know for sure, obviously. I immediately got on the phone and called New York, and we set up a two-way that if Levitan is going to say something at 5:00 Moscow time, 8 hours earlier on the East Coast, we ought to set it up so that CBS in New York would be recording Levitan over Moscow radio. I would be translating what it is that Levitan was reading. CBS would have that immediately in New York. If it was of value, if it was what I thought it might be, we would have, again, a big scoop. I want quickly to add here so there's no misunderstanding. The idea of the scoop was not on my mind then. That was a post facto analysis on my part. At the time, the thing that was on my mind, on everybody's, who knew anything about Levitan Moscow radio when the 5 o'clock broadcast was, this is something big. The minute I heard Levitan's voice, confirming that it was, I began to translate what it is that Levitan was saying. And at a certain point, Levitan, reading a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy, said, in order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which now endangers the cause of peace, the Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you describe as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union. I screamed. He caved. He just caved. In New York, they screamed back. Is that the bulletin? Yes, it is. We went out with the bulletin that the crisis, according to what the Russians are now saying, is on the edge of passing. It was phenomenal because this is all in retrospect thinking. At that moment, the world was literally at the edge of what could have been a nuclear war. And the decision of one man, the leader of the Soviet Union, had the guts at that time to acknowledge in public that he had blown it. It was his crisis. He had produced it. In a funny way, it's like the Ukraine war now. It's Putin's crisis, his war. He's the one who started it. Back then, it was Khrushchev's Cuban adventure. He started, but then he had the guts to pull back. Whether Putin would do the same in Ukraine, I doubt. Immediately thereafter, and I'll kind of wrap this up at this point. If you were either Kennedy or Khrushchev and you had had that experience, it then became possible for you to realize you had to do something to change the dangerous drift toward war between these two superpowers. You could not allow it to continue to endanger the security of the world. And in September of the following year, Khrushchev agreed and Kennedy agreed. This is now September of 1963. They both agreed to the signing of the first atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement. The first time nuclear weapons began to be put under the control of the international community, starting with the United States and the Soviet Union. At that time, Khrushchev was ecstatic with joy and happiness about that agreement. And he began to tell people around him and his son, Sergei, who lived the tail end of his life in the United States, taught at Brown. Sergei said that Khrushchev would go around saying, this is the beginning of a new era in US-Soviet relations. Now, in the next 6 years, we're going to have agreements on everything between him and me, Khrushchev and Kennedy. And people asked him, why 6 years? He said, well, Kennedy has 2 more years in his first term, and then he'll be reelected to a second term. And so there will be 6 years. And it was so, as you look back, so pathetically sad that within a month, Kennedy would be killed, and Khrushchev within a year would be kicked out of power. But for that moment, anyway, his early desire to do something great with Kennedy did pan out, but the price was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Taking a deep breath, and now if you guys would like to fire away with questions, I'd be very, very happy to try to answer.
Well, that was a fascinating and very enlightening story.
Stephen Turo asked, was the removal of the U.S. missiles from Turkey part of the de-escalation in Cuba? That's an excellent question because it does get to a controversial issue that's been kicking around now for decades, and that is the role of the Jupiter missiles, the American Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Was there a secret amendment to the deal on Cuba that obliged the United States within 6 months to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for what Khrushchev was doing in Cuba? I have explored that subject endlessly, and my sense is, well, beyond sense, my belief, very strong belief, is that the discussion about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey was widespread. An American reporter, John Scally, spoke to a Soviet official at the Soviet embassy. They discussed the possibility of the American missiles in Turkey being exchanged for the Soviet missiles in Cuba. Everybody was discussing that. But in the letter, the key letter that Khrushchev sent to Kennedy on Sunday, October 28th, there was no mention of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey at all. Now, it is said, well, it wouldn't be mentioned. It was a secret addendum. No. If there were something that essential to get the Russians to remove their missiles from Turkey, it would have come out in one way or another. It would have leaked. Something would have happened to bring that into confirmation. It's never been part of any written agreement that I'm aware of. It has always been part of the conversation. But conversation is cheap. Words are cheap. It comes down to the words used in an agreement. And there was nothing to indicate that removing the missiles from Turkey would result in Russia removing its missiles from Cuba. The missiles were removed because Khrushchev made up his mind that he had made a horrific mistake. He did not want to see nuclear war. He regarded nuclear war. He spoke about it constantly. There was one phrase he used that I'll never forget. He said that if there were war, the living would envy the dead. The living will envy the dead. Think about that. The living will envy the dead. That was in his mind. So, no, it wasn't the missiles in Turkey at all. McNamara referred to those missiles, I remember, as a pile of junk, which the Russians would know also. Now, there were other questions.
That was a beautiful argument by somebody who just joined real late.
Yeah.
Sorry. Get rid of. Sorry.
When in this story did Khrushchev bang his shoes on the table? He banged his shoes on the table in September of 1960 when he went to the UN to meet with Castro. And he did not think that this was typical Khrushchev, by the way. He did not think he was getting the kind of attention that he deserved. And so he took off his shoes and began to pound the table. He was that kind of a leader. He was not a sophisticated person for whom that kind of activity would have been unimaginable. He was a peasant who became the leader of the Soviet Union. His father was a peasant. His grandfather was a peasant. They came from a small town in the part of Ukraine today that is called the Donbass. And it's that part of Ukraine that is currently controlled by the Russians. Khrushchev was born there, and there was very little schooling in his life. He grew up a politician, totally committed to communism, but he was a communist who believed that the ultimate vision of that dream, that ideology, is to make life better for people. He tried to do that for the Russian people, and because of his stupid blunder in Cuba, he lost that opportunity.
So how do you see, you're talking about a different Russia, and you've talked a fair bit about how the calculations and miscalculations of one individual leader, often sometimes going in a direction opposite of his advisors, can affect history. What can we expect during the tenure of Donald Trump? Do you have any guesses
No,
how
well,
Trump, Putin are going to manage each other,
I
or predictions about Ukraine?
no, I understand. I
Yeah.
understand, Susan. And the two are related, really. Ukraine is very much on the top of a summit agenda that I suspect Putin and Trump are going to be organizing very quickly after Trump is inaugurated. I will be, let me put it this way, very surprised if by the springtime of this year, the two of them have not met and have not reached what they would regard as an acceptable agreement on Ukraine. The agreement that they are both what is being leaked, so to speak, but not really leaked, I think deliberately put out by both sides. What the Russians are saying, and what Putin has always believed to be essential for Russian security, is that Ukraine never be attached to the West, that Ukraine must always be attached literally or figuratively to Russia and Belarus. When Russian nationalists think about Russia, they think about Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. That is the heartland. And that is what has to be protected if you are protecting the Russian homeland. So in Putin's mind, there is no detachment of Ukraine from Russia and Russian interests. He would be perfectly happy, I'm sure, to go along with an agreement that leaves Ukraine neutral, but unable to acquire weapons from the West. Neutral, but essentially demilitarized. That means it would naturally fall under Russian control. So you start with the ceasefire. Ukraine is cut off from NATO and the European Union. And you have that framework of a deal. What is it that Trump is saying now? He says a lot of things very loosely, so you're never sure if that is precise language. But his envoy, the former General Keith Kellogg, and he knows what he's talking about. He has said ceasefire, a kind of loose language here, a kind of demilitarization. Essentially, there's an overlap between Trump's vision of the end of the war in Ukraine and Putin's vision. And were there to be that kind of a deal, well, were there to be that kind of a deal, it would, number one, be a repudiation of everything the United States has said publicly for the last 4 years. President Biden said We will be with you for as long as it takes. But if Trump comes in and repudiates Biden, strikes his deal, what then happens in Ukraine? What are the Ukrainians going to do? In my judgment, there will be the start of a guerrilla war. The war, in other words, in Ukraine will not end. It will just evolve into another form. But there will be fighting, and it will go on. It will go on until Putin is one way or another removed from office.
How can that happen?
And it happened, sure. I mean, my own feeling, although this is based just on a gut, I think that Putin is a short timer. Whether that means he'd be out of office in 6 months or a year, who knows? But a short timer in that Ukraine is Putin's brainchild. He is the only reason there is a war there. And there are many, many people in Russia who have already lost their children, their husbands in this war. We don't know exactly how many Russians have died. The official estimate from the West, not Russia, is more than 70,000 dead and more than 500,000 wounded. That's a lot of people. For Ukraine, they've lost 40,000 and 300,000 wounded. Again, a lot of people. It is a brutal, ugly war that is being pursued as part of an historic dream that Putin has in his mind. He's not crazy. It is a legitimate national aspiration among many right-wing conservative Russians. But they're not the only Russians. There are others.
How much do you think you spoke Russian? You speak Russian, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did most of the journalists then in the 60s and or now who cover the Soviet Union and Putin speak Russian? And
At
how
the
much of
time,
it is it?
At the time, in the early 1960s, there were very few of us who spoke Russian.
Yeah.
And everyone was dependent upon an official translator. Even if you did speak Russian, you had an official translator. And that person not only translated, but did a whole lot of errands and sort of would help run the office. But they were very helpful people. And some of them were really very nice people who would help you spot things in the press that you might have missed, help you if you didn't read Russian, help you read the press. These were essential people. Obviously, if you speak the language, you're that much better. I mean, when I am asked by young journalists today, how do you prepare to be a foreign correspondent? It's the same advice. Learn a language. Not everybody in the world speaks English. I mean, today, Arabic, Hebrew, Russian, Chinese, Persian. I mean, there are obvious languages to learn. It's not just Spanish and French.
Did you study Russian in college? How did you learn Russian?
In college, I studied it for 6 months. But then when I was in graduate school, I made a major effort to study. I started graduate work studying both Russian and Chinese because my PhD program was a split between Russian history and Chinese history. And after 3 months, I dropped Chinese because I was really going out of my mind. I couldn't manage both at all. Much too tough.
each with unique alphabets. There's a question from Laurie about the role of Jackie Kennedy.
Yes, I noticed that.
Yeah.
She gets credit for charming Khrushchev at a dinner party.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, playing the role of softening him up. No. Khrushchev was not being softened by Jackie Kennedy. He certainly appreciated how she looked, how she dressed, the style, the class. I mean, it leaped out at you. There was no question about that. However, that is not what moved Khrushchev in one direction or another. At the time of the summit, I remember very clearly the wives were in a separate world. They went to museums.
Mhm.
There was one very famous gallery. There was one famous gallery where they went, but not together. Mrs. Khrushchev went first, and then Mrs. Kennedy. They went to museums separately, but went to museums. They were at the big, gorgeous dinner that was set up on Saturday night. It was a spectacular dinner party led by obviously these two men and their staffs. But the reporters were not invited. We were not invited at all.
Was your brother involved with Russia at all at this time in his work?
I was involved with my brother at all times.
Yeah.
No, he was 8 years older. He was a journalist, and I learned whatever I learned about journalism from him.
From Bernard.
Yes, he was without any doubt. He exercised an enormous, I think, positive influence over me. If there's anything good that I do, I describe it to him.
You describe it down. That's wonderful. Someone asks, do you have another book which analyzes the Ukraine situation?
Here
writing and writing.
Yes, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, I did a book called Imperial Gamble, which was about Russia and Ukraine. And I predicted, because it was very clear to me then, that Putin was going to act on Ukraine. He already had acted in 2014 on the Crimea. He had already moved forces into the Donbass region of Ukraine. That was the reason for the book Imperial Gamble, and the title also gives away what I thought and still think was on Putin's mind. It was a gamble, of course, but he was prepared to make the gamble because of his imperial ambitions of bringing Ukraine in. For him, bringing it in was essentially stopping Ukraine from establishing an institutional relationship with the West. For example, with NATO, for example, with the European Union. He had to, in his mind, he had to stop that. And so it was a gamble, but he played along with it.
And do you think, were he to win, I don't know how else to put it, in Ukraine, that he would then try to bring other previous socialist republics back into the framework?
Yeah, I think that again, he's a very smart guy, and I don't believe will do anything that intentionally would trigger
a war,
a Western or American military response.
okay.
But remember, if in my imagined summit before the springtime of this year. The two overlapping agreements on how the war ends. Ukraine is then left out in the cold, but that is not Trump's responsibility. He would claim he promised during the campaign to end the war. So he ended the war. And he will claim credit for that. And at this particular point, I don't know exactly how the American people will respond to that. They may very well think it's perfectly fine to ditch Ukraine. And if the word of the United States is damaged, they may say that if Trump says it's a good thing, then it's a good thing. And they will accept that. They have accepted Trump by voting him back into office. And so you can't, wonder how these things happen. It happened. He was elected back into office. It's going to be president.
I think our time is up.
Our time's up. I just want to say again, what a pleasure it is for me to be able to talk to friendly Chevy Chase folks. And it's been wonderful, and I thank you all so much for listening.